All right, good morning. Testing the mic, can you hear me in the back? All right, thank you very much, and welcome to the guests of Gov 103 who have joined us for this open session of our class to process and analyze the election results from the U.S. election on Tuesday. I'm Professor Jennifer Victor. I'm faculty in the Schar School. My area of expertise is in American politics broadly, U.S. Congress specifically, but I also do a fair amount of analysis of current event type stuff. So let me just dive in with where we're going to go and what sort of the goals of our session are here. So first, our goal here is to focus on explanation and assessment of election outcomes. My particular focus is really more on politics than it is on policy. So if you're hoping to hear a long digression on what's going to happen in particular policy areas, it's going to be like 30 seconds at the end. That is not most of what this talk is. If that is your area of interest, there is another panel next week at the Mason Square campus in Arlington on, I think it's Monday at, I don't know, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, I forget when it is. It's the Pizza and Politics session. I'm also on that panel with former Governor Kerry McAuliffe, David Ramadan, Mark Rosell, I believe. Okay. Our goal here is to be partisan neutral. So these are explanations about why events happen. I am not here to advocate. I'm also not, in a way, I'm here to provide some political therapy. But it's not the type of therapy that's designed to make you feel better. Any of you who had therapy know that the purpose of therapy is not really to make you feel better. I mean, it sort of is. But it's also to help you understand things. And for me, processing things that can be challenging or upsetting or anything that really just jars you or takes you for a loop, I operate best when I get myself into that reasoning frontal lobe part of my brain and just start asking a lot of why questions and taking a dive in rather than staying in the sad or depressed or angry or happy or elated or whatever, the amygdala part of the emotional brain. So that's what we're going to do here. We're probably not going to have a ton of time for questions, but I will certainly try to watch the clock and build that in. I do have quite a bit of content to share with you. If I go through something that just really puzzles you or that you really aren't, you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to do so. Okay, the big caveat at the beginning here is this is all very preliminary. The election is just like 24 hours old, basically. The analyses here are very preliminary. They may change. There's a lot of sort of grasping to try to understand what's going on. And so we're going to do our best, but things might shift in the future as we go through things. So here's the agenda for the day. First, I'm going to ask, why are some people upset? Then we're going to walk right through the election results that we know now. Then the big question is, why did Trump win or why did Harris lose? So understanding the outcome of the election results. We'll talk a little bit, that'll be the meat of the talk. That's most of what we're going to do. A little bit on forecasting and polling and where that is. A few comments about turnout and a little bit on campaign finance. And then I'll build in some time, hopefully, to take questions. Okay, so let's start with why are some people upset? So one reason people are upset is because their expectations did not meet with the reality. There were, the polls, this is the polling average from the 538 website across 2024. So this is from March to November. And what you see here is where Biden dropped out and Harris became the nominee. So essentially in the polling average, Harris was ahead the entire time that she was the candidate. And so that baked in a lot of expectations for folks that maybe she would ultimately be the winner. Trump's polling numbers are largely flat. He gets a couple of bumps from a few events, but not a lot of shifting across time. One thing that I do draw from this graph is it tells me that Democrats probably did the right thing in dumping Biden and going with Kamala Harris, because Biden numbers are consistently worse than Harris's or Trump's. The forecasts, 538 are one among many people that engage in quantitative forecasts of election these days. And they all sort of were suggesting the battleground states are too close to call, lots of simulations, like they were almost changing every day. One day it said Harris, the next day it said Trump. It really looked like it was going to be a close election. Everybody's saying it's going to be a close election. Is it going to take a week to find out the results? folks in Gov 103 know that I was pretty confident that we would know the results on Wednesday, which we did. But there was lots of reason to think that it might be close and that it might take a while. Another thing that set people's expectations is their own partisanship and their own sort of wishful thinking about what the outcome was going to be. So when we asked people before the elections, the YouGov survey, what do you expect is going to happen? Basically, Democrats expected, 83% of Democrats expected that Harris would win, and 76% of Republicans, other surveys I've actually seen that number higher, thought that Trump would win. So no matter what the result was, there were going to be a lot of super disappointed people, right? So a lot of people have this confidence baked in, and then reality didn't meet it. And so that's a big part of the explanation of some of the upsetness that we see. Okay, but it turns out it wasn't close at all. So the results are, for those of you that haven't seen it yet, I'll go through this fast because I assume you already, this is part of why you're here, because you already know this. Donald Trump has been declared the winner of the 2024 presidential election. And by the looks of it, he will win both the Electoral College vote and the popular vote. So you might remember that when Trump won in 2016, we had one of these what we call upside down elections where he won the Electoral College vote, but not the popular vote. But it looks like here, when all the votes are counted, we'll have to see what the margin is, but somewhere in the order of 5 million more votes for the Republican candidate. If you prefer a cartogram that doesn't count land, that doesn't vote, and sort of equalizes the population, this is the congressional district sort of version of the map that provides an equivalent population per state. So California, of course, is the most populous, state in the nation by a wide margin, but that's how it breaks down. We're still waiting for the vote counts, the final vote counts from Nevada and Arizona. Looking at the US Senate, the Republicans will take control of the Senate in the 119th Senate that will begin in January. We still don't know the outcome of a couple of elections that are quite close. So they'll either have probably a 53, 54, a few votes margin, but not what we would call a filibuster-proof supermajority, which would be 60 votes in the Senate. So they'll be somewhere hovering around 55. The House is still, majority control in the House is still undetermined. It'll take a few days. There's a lot of close races in California, and California does a lot of mail balloting, and there's a lot of people. So it takes them a while to get through all of their vote counting. There's some other races out in the West, Washington, Oregon, even Alaska, where we still don't know the winner. Right now, the Republicans control 204 seats. Majority control is 218 seats. Democrats currently control 186, and they were, last time I looked, or when I made the slide at least, there were still 45 seats that were still being counted. So we don't know how that one's going to go. If you made me guess, though, and you'll probably make the same guess by the time we're at the end of the lecture here, my guess is it's going to go to Republican control, but maybe not, we'll see. Okay, so now the meat of the lecture, the main reason why folks are here. Why did Trump win, or why did Harris lose, whichever way you prefer to pose the question. So let's run, there's a lot of hypotheses out there, right? So let's just run through some hypotheses and evaluate them with data, and then look at some political science to tell us what's going on. But before I dive into all this, again, lots of caveats, like some of this stuff we're really not going to know. This is sort of the hot take version of all this. So one hypothesis that's out there is that the Latino vote shifted. So if you look at the particularly Latino men, between 2016, 2020, and 2024, this is an exit poll conducted by CNN. You see that in 2020, Latino men had a plus 23-point margin for the Democratic candidate, and this year they really shifted. They were plus 12 for the Republican candidate. So that's a pretty big shift among Latino men. On the other hand, a Pew poll from early in the fall, September, suggested that there were more Latinos that were leaning Harris than leaning Trump. So either these are late-breaking deciding votes, or not as many Latinos voted for the Democratic side, obviously. The other thing to point out about this Latino vote is Latinos are not a monolithic population. And scholars who study Latino politics will tell you that for Latinos in the United States, sort of the further their families or generations get from the immigrant experience, the more the Latino population tends to politically look more like the white population in terms of political behavior. So some of what we're seeing here is we've had long trends over, the last 100 years or so of increasing Latino population in the United States. And many of those families have been here a long time. And so in some ways, it's almost like a political assimilation type effect. But the other thing that I want to point out to you is that the top issue for Latinos, particularly for the Trump supporting Latinos, is the economy. So that's going to become a big theme of where we're going here. For Latinos who care mostly about healthcare, they were more for the Harris supporters. So that's, I'm guessing that's mostly abortion rights, but abortion has its own measurements down here, so it's not just abortion. All right, so there's something to this, but it doesn't seem to me that it's enough to offer the explanation of 5 million votes. All right, so another hypothesis is that women shifted, right? So looking at gender across the last 3 presidential elections, if we look at women, when Hillary Clinton was on the ballot, women gave Clinton a +13 vote advantage. And this year, Harris got a +8 vote advantage. So we do still see a gender gap here. I didn't make a slide on this, I usually do because it's a nice little lesson. The media describes the gender gap wrong and they almost always calculate it wrong. In social science, the way we understand the gender gap is the difference between men and women within support for the winning candidate. So within support for Trump, what is the difference between Harris and Trump? Those numbers aren't actually shown on this graph, but it was about 55-45. So 55% women for Harris and 45% men for Trump. Or excuse me, I did that. Look, I just did what the media did. It's within Trump support, women 45, men 55. So it's about a 10-point gap. And in 2020, it's 8 to 10 points, but it's been like 8 to 10 points for the last number of elections in this kind of range in terms of the gender gap. So women shifted, maybe not really. Yes, there is a gender gap, but it's not remarkably different in order to help us explain the election outcome. Another hypothesis, Middle East sympathy, strong feelings, particularly among Democrats, whose party's coalition is essentially divided on issues about how to handle violence in the Middle East. But here we see that, so Jewish voters in the United States are only 2% of the population, but they still overwhelmingly supported the Democratic candidate. So, there's more to it than that, and this exit poll doesn't have information on Muslim identifying, those who get caught up in the other religious, but even among the other religious, Harris is still winning. So again, I don't see enough sort of variation across the religion numbers that make me think that it was Middle East sympathy of some kind to one party or another that would explain the election outcome. A third hypothesis, or whatever number we're on, is that there's a third party spoilers, right? So Jill Stein was on the ballot. There was lots of sort of protest votes against the Biden administration on Israeli policy, particularly in Michigan. So here, Michigan is sort of the most conservative case that we can make about this. You can see here the vote between Trump and Harris is very narrow. It's less than 100,000 votes. That's like 70,000 votes or something like that. And if you add all of these votes up for the third party candidates, it does technically add up to more than the differential between these. But you wouldn't expect all of those candidates to have gone, all of these votes to have gone to just one of these candidates. So even in the hardest test case, there just isn't enough evidence to suggest that we should look to third party spoilers as the reason that Donald Trump won the election. Okay, so if it's not these sort of hypotheses we've already looked at, other hypotheses that I can guarantee political scientists will be looking at over the next few years is this idea that there's a wide swath of Americans who are simply frustrated by economic prospects. They are frustrated by the high cost of education, by the high cost of housing, by the high cost of healthcare, and by the high cost of dependent care. Those 4 economic areas, housing, education, healthcare, and dependent care, are making it very challenging for Americans to put themselves into a financial position that makes them better off than their parents were. That's sort of American dream ideal. It feels more out of reach for more people than it has. And so that'll be something that we'll be looking at. Of course, we had a Black female, a woman of color at the top of the ticket for the Democratic Party. So was there some racial animus or hostile sexism? Some of the analysis from the 2016 campaign showed that there was some hostile sexism that explained a fair amount of vote for Trump or against Clinton in that campaign. We'll have to see if some of that shakes out this year or not. looking at things about misinformation, foreign interference, all of these may to some extent play some role in this. But we don't know the answers to these questions yet, and it's going to take us a while to really get good answers on these questions. So I urge you to be patient, take things as they come, and the other thing about this is some of what these hypotheses that are now sort of floating around the internet tell me is that people are looking for sort of granular level, like it's this small subpopulation's fault or that small subpopulation's fault or something like that, or credit, whichever way you think the arrow points. And to be honest, there's just not great evidence for that because of this. This is the graph that tells the story of what happened in this election. What you're seeing here, and it's incomplete because of I grabbed this before all the vote counting is done, but this is a county by county visualization of the shift in marginal vote for either the Democratic or the Republican candidate in all counties. So red is towards Republican and blue is towards Democrat. So what we see here is really a practically uniform shift across the whole country, really, in favor of, relative to the last election. So this is comparing 2020 to 2024. Relative to the last election, this is really a uniform shift. This is worth explaining. And this says to me that if you see a uniform shift like this, it's not the nuances of some subpopulation of voters. This is something systematic. This is something that is affecting practically the whole population, maybe not affecting them uniformly, but affecting them in a way that is producing a uniform observation. So now the question is, what caused that? What caused a uniform shift in the electorate towards Trump? Okay, so a big part of the answer to that question is this graph. This is coming from 538 polling data. The pink is, so this is Joe Biden's approval ratings from the beginning of his presidency to the modern time. And what we see in pink is disapproval and in green is approval. So when he was first elected, his approval ratings were, you know, in the 50s, above water, we might say. But fairly quickly, before he was even a year into his presidency, he got underwater, meaning his disapproval ratings were higher than his approval ratings. And his approval ratings have stayed underwater and under that 50% mark throughout the last 3 years. And today, it's around 38% is his approval rating, right? So that's a devastatingly low approval rating for an incumbent going into an election, which is part of why he got talked into dropping out and putting somebody else on the ticket, because they thought, well, if Joe Biden is this unpopular, then we'll just switch candidates and give ourselves a better chance. That's kind of what parties are supposed to do. The whole purpose of a political party is to organize yourselves to win elections. So there's nothing particularly wrong, and the data suggests that was probably a good choice on their part. And the Harris campaign was remarkably a disciplined campaign. I think history will be kind to the campaign in terms of how it was run and so forth. But there's no overcoming this disapproval. And one way to think about it is it's not just disapproval of Joe Biden. It's disapproval of the incumbent party who is in office, right? So here's the money graph. I know I'm going to say that a couple of times. I'll just warn you. This is so Barry Burns, a political scientist at the University of Wisconsin, who does a lot of election work. These original data graph comes from a 2016 book by John Seidel Babrick and Mike Kessler, who write about elections and so forth, political scientists. And this is incumbent party approval. So this is the incumbent party presidential approval rating in June of the election year on the x-axis. And on the y-axis, it's the incumbent party to-vote share, right? So basically, and the line is a linear regression prediction line. So basically what we're saying is that when incumbents have high approval ratings, the incumbent party tends to win. So those are all elections in which the incumbent party won, and high incumbent approval and winning. And these are all elections in which the incumbent party lost. Low incumbent party approval ratings, election loss. Joe Biden is here. If you use the regression line to predict what Joe Biden's vote share would be in this election, by saying that graph we were looking at a minute ago, his approval rating is 38.5%, The regression spits out a 48% Democratic vote share. Does anybody know what, remember what Kamala Harris's vote share was?
47.5.
Exactly. So this is spot on, right? This is a very predictive relationship. So one way to look at this is they were cooked, right? Democrats kind of didn't have any hope from the beginning. All right, so there's a theory in political science that we use to describe this. There was a paper published in 1995 by an elections scholar named Chris Valazian, and the theory is known as thermostatic politics. And the idea of thermostat is a very simple idea. It's simply the sense that in an election, there's like a thermostat, and during the election is when the voters come and adjust the thermostat to either be colder because they think it's too hot in here, or warmer because they think it's too cold in here, or whatever. And what the theory suggests is that when voters are dissatisfied, they change parties. They unelect the incumbents and put somebody else in. It's the time for a change kind of idea of thinking about how politics works. And this idea of thermostatic politics, you might think it's remarkable, like that seems like a very simple idea. How is that only like 30 years old? 1995 wasn't that long ago. But that's because in this era of heightened partisan polarization, this is a time when this type of theory becomes much more useful in terms of explaining outcomes. Okay, so the economy is a priority concern for most people. So if you look at the US economy under Joe Biden, these are Gallup numbers across time from the Trump administration through the Biden administration. The share of US adults who cite economic problems as the most important issue facing the United States. And during the Trump administration, it really wasn't the most important issue for most people. And then the pandemic, of course, happens. Biden assumes office, and we get a huge economic effect related to the pandemic that the Biden administration strongly reacts to with both fiscal and monetary policy. But inflation shoots up to 9% during that period. And people get super crabby about that, rightfully so. That's a thing worthy of being crabby at. They enact their policies to the point that even though, as I'll show in a second, the macroeconomic indicators all improved, like by all accounts, I think historians will on the macroeconomics be very kind to the Biden presidency in terms of assessment. But people's mood about it didn't shift that much, right? People were still reminded of the fact that eggs are $3.50 a dozen or whatnot. Another thing that happens is this is a graph that shows consumer credit cards, the amount of revolving debt that Americans have. So when you feel financially strapped, one strategy that a lot of folks use is they put it on a credit card. Credit is fairly easy to access in the United States. Credit interest rates are extremely high for this type of consumer spending. So it's a terrible way to finance your, latest, video game and clothing purchase. But if you're just trying to feed your family and get food on the table, and that's how you're going to figure out how to afford it, then that's what people do. And so what we see here is starting with the pandemic era, the amount of money that Americans are charging on their credit cards has just really been climbing and continues to climb. Even during a time of heightened interest rates, when the cost of borrowing money is going up through that time, that increased cost of borrowing is not deterring people, which tells us from an economics point of view that is not just like a personal choice, oh, I really want that new pair of sneakers. This is I have no other choices, I'm going to have to finance this on my card kind of situation. Okay, here's those macroeconomic indicators I alluded to. So Biden oversaw a very robust economic change over the course of his presidency. So the graph on the left shows economic growth over the course of his presidency. So you can see growth absolutely plummet, more than 30 points during the pandemic. And then it almost immediately bounces back as we were coming out of the pandemic. Biden assumes office right about there, and then growth more or less stabilizes. This doesn't happen in all countries around the world, by the way. So the US, and I didn't make a comparative politics graph on this topic, but the US really did perform much better coming out of the pandemic than most other countries did. Most countries were much more austere in their fiscal stimulus that they provided, whereas the Biden administration was extremely generous with folks. I don't know how many of you have children in the room, but I was getting a check $500 per kid per month there for a year or so, which is very nice. That was, coming straight from the Biden administration into my bank account, direct deposit, and that was happening for millions and millions of people. And that stimulus kept people out of poverty during the crushing experience of the pandemic. So they're able to, using fiscal and monetary tools, they're able to keep growth steady. Growth is at around 3% now, which is in fact better than economists think it would have been even if the pandemic had never happened. So that's a real bright spot for the success of fiscal policy for the Biden administration. But even though we had that growth, we still got to 9% inflation. And people don't forget that, especially when you've got talking heads at you telling you all the time that inflation is awful. Policies of the Biden administration also helped wage growth keep up with inflation. So wage growth, you can see now, is at a greater rate than inflation is. So even though prices are still high, most people have wages that are allowing them to meet those obligations in ways that are useful, but it hasn't affected their sentiment so much or their mood. This is a similar story under unemployment. Unemployment, of course, shoots up to like 15% during the pandemic. Biden assumes office, and then they're able to get that one back down. We also had record stock market during the Biden term of office as well. Okay, despite all of that, Americans are super discouraged. Yeah, quick question?
Do we have access to these slides?
I will post them on my website. So if you Google my name and GMU, they're not on the website yet, but this afternoon I'll post it.
Thank you.
Yep. So despite the positive macroeconomic indicators, Americans are super discouraged. So this is a Gallup survey going all the way back to when I was in preschool. But basically this survey that Gallup's been asking forever that says, like, how satisfied are you with the way things are going in the United States right now? And you can see the big drop during the pandemic here, and it kind of comes back up, but it's only at 26%. Like, that's pretty low. It's almost historically low if you think about the average across this whole time period. So Americans are really discouraged about where things are. In addition, economic confidence is much lower under Biden than it was under Trump, despite the pandemic. So this graph this is the Trump administration and the Biden administration, and the y-axis is the US CPI. So it's the confidence indicator in the economic performance. And what we see really is that even though the pandemic started under Trump, the pandemic economy is associated with Biden. So both presidents experienced the pandemic, and arguably the pandemic and the aftermath of all of that is part of the story of how Donald Trump lost his incumbency election in 2020. So maybe he also got blamed for it, but it seems that Joe Biden is also now getting blamed for the pandemic economy that we are still kind of coming out of. Okay, another thing here is that tells me that this is something systematic, not something about some niche subpopulation, is that there's a lot of elections in the world this year, and many of them are seeing incumbents lose elections. So in these countries, we have seen incumbent party wins over the course of this calendar year. And in these countries, we have seen incumbent party losses. Now, usually incumbents win, right? So to see this many incumbent party losses in countries like the UK and India and South Korea and so forth is a really big deal. So what we are seeing in the United States is really just one of essentially a global phenomenon of people who are frustrated in their experience with the, you guys both found an error, didn't you? Because
the Austrian flag is upside down, is sideways.
Where's Austria? Oh, it is, you're right. I didn't make that part of the graph, so I won't take credit for that one. Yeah, Venezuela, I didn't color because it's a very complicated case.
Yeah, France.
France is also a very complicated case that is not, you could say either way. Macron did get reelected, so maybe that would be fair to put France in the win column, but people could argue on the parliament other things. So in any case, the point is incumbent party losses are a thing this year, and it's not just in the United States. Okay. Another sort of systemic way of thinking about what we're experiencing and what we've observed is to think about party coalitions over time. So I've shown a version of this graph to my to Gov 103, and it looks a little bit complicated, so take me just a second to walk through it. Essentially, what we're looking at here is the x-axis here in the middle. So this is a typical Euclidean xy plane. This is typical liberal conservative scale, but mostly on economic issues, right? So economic liberalism, like I favor wealth redistribution, and this is economic conservatism, which is I oppose wealth redistribution, essentially. And the vertical axis, the y-axis, is a social dimension, with liberals being up here and conservatives being down here. And I'm going to interpret this mostly as favor or opposition to civil justice, civil rights, and efforts, government support for providing policies that equalize different types of injustice. So you can think then of the four quadrants as being political types, party types. So here, liberal social and liberal economic are sort of the traditional liberals, people like Al Gore or Jimmy Carter. And over here in this axis, you have the traditional conservatives, like maybe Bush's and Reagan's, social conservative, economic conservative. In the cross quadrants, you can come up with different names for this, but for lack of a better term, I'll call the social liberals, economic conservatives, the cosmopolitans. So these are like the Arnold Schwarzenegger politicians of the world, people who sort of favor business, but also are interested in greater racial justice. And in the opposite corner, you have the populists. So the populists can either be liberal or conservative, which is made clear on this graph. But the populists are anti-elite and anti-big business kind of sentiment. So what the graph is showing is if you plot where the two presidential candidates were in each election, so this one's sort of starts with thinking about the 1960 election, you would put John F. Kennedy over here and Richard Nixon over here, and so the dividing line between them would look pretty close to that y-axis. And if you continue to plot the two main party presidential candidates over the last 50, 60 years, what you would notice is that that cleavage line, where you think about where the Democratic candidate is, and you think about where the Republican candidate is, essentially in a fairly systematic fashion is doing this clockwise kind of shift across time. Such that the hypothesis is that the cleavage this year might look something like this, with Donald Trump being down here as a populist and Harris Biden being kind of up there with the cosmopolitans. So that suggests to me some information about who's included in the party coalitions. So how do AOC and Dick Cheney wind up in the same party coalition? Well, it's because AOC is here and Dick Cheney is here, and they're both on this side of the line. And that's where the Democratic coalition is this year. And same kind of thing on the Republican side. Okay. I'm going to move on. So that's the big picture explanation about the why of the election. So just a few minutes here on forecasting. So the Political Science Journal PS puts out each election, presidential election season, these political science models. There were like, I don't know, 8 or 9 political science models that were published this year. And I want to say 5 of them predicted Trump and 3 of them, I think, predicted Harris as a winner of the ones that were predicting electoral college outcomes. But the one that got it the closest, that appears to have gotten it spot on, is this one written by Peter Enns and his co-authors, who also published a similar model in 2020. And it's really a data set that's based on 2 main characteristics. And the theory is kind of driven on this thermostatic idea. But if you look at presidential approval and economic performance, just those 2 things, but you measure them very carefully at a state level, then they produce simulated models that scarily accurately are predicting congressional or election outcomes. So this is their prediction map that they get from the output of their whole model. And I think what we're going to see at the end of the day, when everything is all said and done, that this is the election map of this year, that they will have gotten it almost exactly right. And so what that tells me is it's the fundamentals, right, that's driving election outcomes. It's not the itty bitty characteristics of the horse race stuff or the daily scandals or this candidate or that candidate. It's these big thermostatic features of our politics and our economy. The 103 students will know that we did talk about fundamental predictions in class a couple of weeks ago, but I shared with you a different fundamentals model, one that's been around quite a bit longer by Alan Abramowitz. It's called the time for change model. The difference between Abramowitz's model, which, if you remember in class at the time I had said, predicted, his model this year predicts a slight probability of a Harris win. But the difference between that model and this one is that the Abramowitz model accounts for incumbency. It says that first term incumbents usually get reelected, second term incumbents usually don't. And he factors that into the model. And that used to be true, but now we've had 2 elections in a row where first term incumbent presidents have lost their elections. So it seems like that first term incumbency is inconsistent perhaps with the thermostatic model. And so this sort of updated version of fundamentals is looking like a better way to understand what happens. Okay, there'll be a lot of hemming and hawing about the polls. This is the 3rd election in a row where polls have struggled to capture the electorate in the preceding period to the election. So what you see here, let me just explain, there's a lot going on. Each one of these boxes, this is made by Tom Wood, who's a terrific pollster, data analyst rather. So the boxes are states. So you got Arizona, Florida, Georgia, etc. This one's Michigan, this one's Wisconsin. And then each little line on the x-axis within the box are elections. So this is, the first dot is the 2004 election, the second dot is Obama's 08 election, and so on and so forth. The red dot is the current election, the 2024 election. And then the y-axis in each box is the polling average overestimation of the Democratic margin of the vote. So how much did the polls miss to capture, and the Democratic margin is just because you have to pick one or the other, and so that part's arbitrary. If they did Republicans, it would just all be flipped. And what we're showing here is over the last few elections, we've had this polling error that is basically, the error is favoring Democrats, but it is undercounting the Republican vote. And we've now seen it for 3 elections in a row. It does appear that the polling error this year is less than it was in the last 2 elections, except for Iowa there, the little Ann Seltzer effect, for Ann. And Florida also, like there's some stuff going on in Florida that we're not capturing very well. But at the end of the day, what's going on here is that like polling is fine. As an industry, polling is about taking a population about which you want to know something, sampling from it and measuring it. Like there's solid mathematics and computations behind that process. What's problematic here is that what these people are doing is forecasting. They're trying to guess who's going to vote. And then they're also struggling to measure with some random sample that guessed population of who's going to vote. And there's just a lot of error in that. And so the suggestion, the hypothesis that's been running in these circles for several years now is that among the populists, think about the XY plane graph a second ago, among the populists, the conservative populists, there is because it's how all populist political movements work, there's a strong bet towards anti-expertise. Sort of anti-elitism, anti-expertise. And so if that's your political motivating narrative that you are driven by, and you get a phone call from a pollster saying, hey, I'd like to know your attitudes, I'm from such and such a firm, blah, 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 that might sound like elitism or expertise, or just like, I don't care. I don't believe you, you're made up, whatever. I'm told to think this is all fake, and so I'm not going to participate. And essentially there's a systematic non-response bias where conservative leaning voters are less likely to respond. And pollsters knew that this year, and they tried to correct for it by essentially weighting their models on, if you were a Republican who voted in 2020, you got higher weight in their models. And there's a lot of criticism across this industry about that particular modeling choice. A lot of folks thought that that was kind of a lame way to try to correct this problem and that it wouldn't work and that the pollsters were going to look wrong again. They do still look wrong again, but in the same direction as they have before. So that choice does not, in retrospect, look to be a bad modeling choice. But in fact, it's still insufficient, which is all kinds of problematic. Hang on to your question for just a second. Okay, I gave a talk a couple weeks ago where somebody asked me about the prediction markets, and I was admittedly sort of dismissive of the prediction markets. So these are these markets that have been legalized in the United States now, where people can go on and as investors sort of and buy shares of what they think is going to happen in an election. And I have been dismissive of them because I was seeing some evidence, because markets of this type, of this sort of predict the future type thing, are highly subject to manipulation or to waves of misinformation coming in, or people can cook this stuff because it's not very well regulated fairly easily. And so I was not really paying attention to the prediction markets this year. It turns out, however, they look pretty decent. That the prediction markets had said since early October, like basically all month leading up to the election, that Donald Trump was more likely to be the winner than Harris was. And so on result alone, the prediction markets wind up looking better than I think a lot of people thought coming out of this election. I think there's still reasons to be somewhat skeptical of them going forward, but I think perhaps because of this experience, a lot more folks will take them seriously. The idea being, if you're going to go so far as to invest your money in one of these things, you're probably doing it from a place of some kind of information, expertise, interest, whatever, that you know something. Otherwise, you wouldn't be putting your own money behind it. Okay. Couple of thoughts here about turnout. So this is historical turnout since the beginning of the first US election. This just measures the voting share of the voting eligible population. So this is people who are allowed to vote, people who have, so this does not take into account the US's very mixed and troubled history on suffrage rights. Right? Suffrage rights expand primarily in this period. And you can see it's not reflected in the graph because this isn't accounting for the total proportion of the population can vote. It's just looking at, who's eligible, how many of them vote. And so here you can see in the 2020 election, we had super high turnout. It was in the 68-ish% range, which is unusually high in the modern period. It had really high turnout that pandemic year. This year turnout in 2024 is looking to be at or perhaps a little bit under. It's looking like it's going to be 2 or 3 percentage points less than what we saw in 2020. So it seems that perhaps that's in part where we're seeing, Harris got many millions fewer votes than Joe Biden did. So Joe Biden got 81 million votes, and she's at like 67 million or something like that right now. We'll see what the final number is at the end of the day. But it seems like there's a lot of Democrats who turned out in 2020 who just didn't turn out this year. And so the puzzle going forward is going to be why. What is it, what is it that's motivated those people to either switch their vote or by the raw numbers looks like they just stayed home. Okay, so another component of understanding turnout is this concept of negative partisanship. So negative partisanship, my class will remember, is the idea that you define your own party identity, not based on what you like or want, but rather as an animus toward the other party, as a way of expressing some discontent with your out party. And what we see here is that in both the 2020 and 2024 election, there was a fairly high, rate of people voting for Trump because they wanted to vote for Trump among Republicans. And for people who were voting against the other guy, it was more Democrats by 23 points in this election, in fact, which isn't as much as we got in the 2020 election. But Democrats were more motivated by voting against Trump than they were by voting for Harris. That's what you get from that graph. So that, and on the one hand, we saw a lot of campaigning material and rhetoric and speeches from the Harris campaign that were going on and on about, Trump is going to be bad and Trump this and Trump that. They were trying to spike this, absolutely. And they didn't hit the mark anywhere near the way that Biden did when Biden wasn't really trying to spike that kind of sentiment in people. So that is a suggestion that maybe the campaign didn't hit on the message that was going to be their winning message, perhaps. Okay, getting a little bit more local for a second. Looking at the state of Virginia. Virginia has much lower turnout across the board. So on the x-axis here, you have 2020 turnout, and on the y-axis, you have 2024 turnout. So anything on the yellow side of the line is and the dots are counties. So anything on the yellow side of the line is a county that had higher turnout this year than it did in 2020. And you will see there are no counties in Virginia that had higher turnout this year than they did in 2020 across the board, whether it's a Republican or Democratic county. 200,000 fewer people voted in 2024 in Virginia than in 2020. So that seems like a motivation problem. That's also reflected in the fact that Virginia wasn't called until like after 11:30 on election night. Usually you would see Virginia called much earlier. So there's that's a story to dig into further. Getting even more local, looking at Fairfax County. What you have here is turnout in 2020 and turnout in 2024, just like the last one. And all of these blue X's are the different precincts in Fairfax County. And this one down here is George Mason University, Merton Hall. Okay, so, whoops, sorry. So on the one hand, yes, our precinct on campus has by far the lowest turnout of any precinct in the county. However, it also has the lowest number of registered voters. And those voter rolls, like there's so much transience, like every year we have a whole new student population on campus, right? Every year, and over the course of 4 years, it's a completely new voter roll from 2020 than it was from 2024, right? So there's a huge amount of turnover that goes into that. Which makes it a very, and this does not capture all of the students who voted but didn't vote on campus, who voted absentee or, went home or whatever, right? So this is just capturing the people who vote there. Later, next year, sometime, it takes a while, we will get the numbers on the overall voter turnout of Mason students. Last year, or last presidential election year, it was 72%. So I don't know if we will, Mike, after looking at these data, I'm gonna say maybe we're not gonna hit that, what I'm saying. But if you look, there is still a positive story to be told here, a very good one actually. And that is, notice how close to the line our little X is and how far from the line all the little blue X's is. What does that mean?
Yeah.
That means everybody had lower turnout relative to 2020, but Mason had less lower turnout. So this graph, so we are the best in Fairfax County, the best is defined as the least bad, right? So all Fairfax County precincts had lower turnout. The average differential across all of these is 9 points lower. But at Mason, there we are, it's about 1 point. 0.98 to be precise, percentage points lower. So what does that mean? What does that tell you? These people, so I have spent since the beginning of August in partnership with the Provost's office and the League of Women Voters and University Life and the Democracy Lab learning community, going into classrooms and working our butts off for voter turnout on campus. And this says to me that worked, that we actually really did something. So big hand of raise your hand if you're actually in that photo. Nice. All right. Last word on campaign finance. I can give a whole nother lecture on entirely this topic, but I think I've just got 2 slides through here. So there was no contest in the money race. Harris outraised Trump by 50%. So Harris raised $1 billion that was just to her funding committee, and another more than $500 million was spent by outside groups on her behalf in support of her or anti-Trump. And altogether, that's $1.5 billion. Trump, on the other hand, only raised less than $400,000 to his candidate committee and had just about $750 million spent on his behalf and outside groups. So one way to think about this, not only was the fundraising on the Democratic side just like off the hook this year, looks very much like what it did in 2020. The numbers are scarily similar to what it was in 2020. So whatever infrastructure Democrats have put in place for fundraising, all those texts you've been getting, if that's your name, all of that is having some effect. But the big thing to point out here is the differential. So Harris is very much relying on individual contributions to her campaign. Much more so than on the outside groups, right? Whereas Trump is exactly the opposite. He's very much relying, 2/3 of what he's getting is coming from outsiders that he's supposedly not even coordinating with, and only 1/3 of his total funding is coming from people who are directly giving to him. So that's a really big differential in how we think about who is behind each candidate or supporting each candidate with their pocketbook, The last thing to say about campaign finance, I aggregated these data. So this looks at since 2012. So in 2010, we had a big Supreme Court decision called Citizens United that changed the way campaign finance works because it made possible that whole outside group spending scenario. And ever since then, we've seen the birth of what are called super PACs, which is a name I hate because they're neither super nor PACs. But in any case, over the course of the last 6 presidential elections, super PACs are becoming an increasingly important part of understanding where campaign finance comes from. So super PACs are not coordinated with the campaigns. They're out there spending their own, raising and spending money on behalf of candidates in support of and against and so forth. And they are swamping what's going on in terms of doing more of the campaign work than the individuals and the corporation PACs and so forth. And the parties. Okay, summing up. In 2020 election, we saw an unpopular incumbent, Donald Trump, lose his re-election for being an unpopular incumbent. In 2024, essentially, you've seen the exact same thing. This is the thermostatic model. An unpopular incumbent lost their re-election because they were wildly unpopular. If thermostatics continues to be a useful model for understanding election outcomes, then, and if you align Democratic, then you'll like this part, Governor Spanberger, perhaps. So the trend in Virginia, so 2025, Virginia will have a gubernatorial election year. The trend in Virginia over the last number of years is whichever party wins the White House, the other party takes the governor's mansion in Virginia. And so there's now sort of a structural advantage built in for a Democratic candidate to take the governor's mansion in Virginia. And Abigail Spanberger is by far the Democratic frontrunner for that nomination. So the likelihood that she has an advantage for next year, I think, is pretty baked in. Thermostatic model would also tell us that Democrats might have a pretty good year in the 2026 midterms. Maybe going into 2028, it'll swing back. It's hard to say, of course. Okay, a couple more things to say now, going a little bit into the what next. Because what we have experienced, now we're done explaining the election and talking about consequences now. What we've experienced in the United States and across the globe, not just here, is a concerning backsliding of democratic norms and values and institutions. So in our president-elect, we have somebody who uses lies and violence, who tried to steal the last election. He was impeached twice. He's been convicted of 34 felonies. He never puts his assets into a blind trust, which makes him open for all sorts of corruption as a president. He used his presidency to advance his own personal business interests very directly in violation of the Constitution's Emoluments Clause. He openly expresses a desire to do things like jail political adversaries and expresses violence towards the free press. All of these are illiberal aspects of his politics that are authoritarian tendencies, right? So we've seen it in his candidacy since he declared back in 2015, and it hasn't really, a lot of this hasn't really changed, except coming into this presidency, he's got more experience. He knows a lot more about how the system works and what might happen and how to do it. Okay, one thing to caution you against that you'll hear a lot in this post-election period is people sometimes talk a lot about mandates. Somebody who wins will say, I won, therefore I have a mandate to do whatever it is I want to do. Election mandates are really a myth. They don't exist. And the reason for that is a mandate suggests some kind of consensus. There is no consensus, right? There are millions of Americans that voted other ways. We've got huge polarization, partisan and otherwise, in the United States. There is no consensus about what the right thing to do is. All we've seen is a thermostatic response to people saying, we don't like where we've been, right? So be careful of election mandate narratives. I expect to see big things on the Supreme Court over the next 4 years. So Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito are very conservative leaning justices who've been on the court a very long time. They're both kind of getting up there in age, particularly Thomas. So the likelihood that either one or both of them will retire during the next Trump administration is very strong, which means that he would have the opportunity to replace them with 2 more probably very conservative leaning justices, which will mean that over the course of 12 years, at the end of his presidency, he will have appointed 5 justices of the 9 on the Supreme Court, which we've never seen before from a president. That will be unprecedented. So it locks in a 6-3 majority for a couple of generations, really. Looking at his policy proposals, the Project 2025 stuff, some of the stuff that he's been talking about on the campaign trail, it's likely that we are going to see a dismantling to some extent of the regulatory state, right? Talking about putting people who don't believe in science in charge of science agencies, talking about not believing in climate change and, sort of investing more in fossil fuels right at the time when we're having a climate emergency. All of this is consistent with populism, and it's consistent with an anti-regulatory bent about how government should work. That's a little bit libertarian, but it's not just libertarian. It's because it's got that anti-expertise kind of element to it. Will we see economic tariffs? There's almost universal statements by economists who will tell you that tariffs are generally bad. They will increase prices for Americans. They will cause employment issues and other kinds of stuff. But Donald Trump has been talking about tariffs for months, saying so much as to like maybe we'll get rid of the income tax and do tariffs again instead, which would just blatantly be terrible economic policy. Then there's his whole plan about doing mass deportations. So there's almost no question that he will try this in some form. What it looks like, how it works, who it affects, nobody knows, right? If we use his first presidency as a way to guide ourselves what we think the next one will look like, I might expect the deportation thing to be like, Mexico build the wall thing, which is to basically say that we did it, but not. And so that maybe that's what will happen here, but there's so much animus around this particular issue, and he's heightened it, and there's so much misinformation about it, that it's likely that we will see some policy action there. In foreign policy, thinking, support for Ukraine, Israel, etc. These are all going to be big question marks. This election will have a massive impact on the global world order. It's going to be felt from around the globe. All right, thank you for your attention, and I'll take your question. Yeah, tell me your name.
So thank you for hosting this. My name is Griffin. I really appreciate you making this open to everyone.
Yep.
I have two questions, but the first one I wanted to ask is regarding the approval rating. Something I've heard and read, and sometimes it might be wrong, but that the approval rating really went down around Afghanistan, and it never really recovered.
Yeah, that's true.
How do you think that plays in with the narrative of it has gotten fine? I do think it's true, but if it's been kind of a sustained disapproval since then, is that just something we thought about better, something we thought about working like that?
Yeah, that's a fair question. The whole withdrawal from Afghanistan thing was, we could debate about like the policy in terms of what the US should or should not have done there. But it's absolutely clear that Biden took a huge hit in terms of his popularity for that. And he didn't ever recover, but I wouldn't interpret that to mean that 38% that he's at now is still people saying I'm mad about the Afghanistan thing. I don't think that's what we're actually saying. I think people got disgruntled about that, and then they found other things to be disgruntled about. That has made it very difficult for him to rebound. A lot of his popularity numbers are baked in by partisanship, right? It's really, really hard for presidents to get above 50% these days, just because of the way negative partisanship works. So taking a big hit, although, you go back a few elections, you can see other presidents and they've got more variation in how their approval ratings go. And we just stopped seeing that kind of variation. Like Obama had huge variation over the course of his two presidencies. And Biden just sort of started here and then did this. And that's, whether that's something about Biden or the current state of things, or it's, I think we don't exactly know how to explain those macro trends.
Well, thank you.
Yep, Eris.
I have two long-winded questions to this answer, whichever one suits you.
Can you try to ask one and put a question mark at the end of it?
Sure.
Great.
So my question is, we were talking about like the economic earlier with Joe Biden, right? And then like potential misinformation there. If we were to look back into 2016 to 2020, what would you say what was like Donald Trump's like affecting the economy? And if we were to compare it to Joe Biden's overall, who would you think would have a more negative impact on the economy? Question mark. And then the second question I had is looking at while we were looking at the graph earlier, for example, like the economy, for example, one reason why Joe Biden, like people didn't like him, but then he showed the graph earlier. What are like the general things that people have problems with the Biden administration and then like his presidency? And then based on that, would you say that a lot of the issues people had with Joe Biden were based on misinformation, or is there genuine like strong reasoning and like that for why they didn't like him?
So taking your second question first, I think there is a disconnect in the Democratic Party I mean, I say this with a little bit of a grain of salt, because they did win in 2020. But the way this went was, the Democrats nominate Hillary Clinton in 2016, who wins the popular vote, but loses the Electoral College in some kind of fluky ways. But the way that the Democratic Party responds to that is, oh, we need a safe old white guy, right? So nominating the white lady was a bad idea. Let's go with safe old white men, and they wind up with Joe Biden. And that worked, right? So, and they stick with Biden, although a lot of people sour on him. And the way the Harris thing came about is a whole different, it wasn't, it was strategic and well crafted, but it wasn't, it was done very fast. There are people who say maybe Democrats would have been better off if they had a normal primary cycle, or, had the opportunity for Democratic candidates to compete or whatnot. And the cycle didn't include that, which there's nothing wrong with that from a party politics point of view. But what I see across those sort of 8 years of Democratic politics is a struggle for Democrats to connect with voters on these issues about economics, about how hard it is to buy a house, about how hard it is to pay for college and get access to healthcare and pay for dependent care. Those 4 things, again, I think are what a lot of people are super frustrated about, as we've seen lots of shifts in the economy. And I don't think either political party has good answers on this. I think the Harris Party's answer, the Democratic Party this year, their answers on this have been like, give people a $25,000 tax credit. And like, from an economic standpoint, that's not gonna work out all that great. A little bit here and there, but overall not well. And you saw the parties, the Democrats and the Republicans converging on things like no taxes on tipped wages, which is just bad public policy, no matter who's proposing it. So the Democrats seem to be grasping at straws a little bit and trying to copy the Republicans, where they think Republicans have tapped into something that they feel like they can handle on economic policy. But I don't think they have like a genuine alternative message about how to address these 4 big structural inequalities on economics. And the Republican message is just populism. It's just hate, and it's, anger, and it's be mad at the rich people, be mad at this. And that is motivating because it gives people an enemy. It gives people something to point to. And so the Republicans, from a electoral standpoint, have had a better message. I think a more winning message, at least that's what we're going to take away from this election, than the Democrats have. And I think the Democrats are going to have to wrestle with that over the next few years. Your first question, I already forgot, had something to do with approval ratings.
So, it was looking back at, when we looked at the economics for Joe Biden.
Oh, yeah, the economics.
And then comparing it to Donald Trump's,
If you look at those meta statistics, you go back and look at some of the graphs that are in the deck, but the meta statistics across both Biden and Trump's presidencies on the economy are pretty decent, actually. Trump, of course, had the big tax cuts, which was stimulating, so you saw growth. One thing that's very interesting that is going to come to haunt somebody at some point is that both political parties right now do not have big factions that are worried about debt and deficits. The only people that are worried about debt and deficits right now are whoever's in the out party, who doesn't want to sign on to whatever costly thing the in party wants to do. That's the only time we see anybody talking about debt and deficit. And our debt to GDP ratio in the United States is pretty scary. It's not really, it's not like Greece level scary, but it is getting to a point where, because the US dollar is still a world reserve currency, so we've got a lot of good faith insurance baked into our system, but we are not paying our bills, and we are not putting ourselves on a track to help pay our bills. And at some point, if there is a global shake in faith on the US dollar, it'll hit America very badly because where our debt is. So, but that's not Trump, that's not Biden or Harris, that's US politics right now. And a lack of political incentive or will to take the long-term sort of pain that it's going to cost to kind of handle that. Vincent.
So on the news today, I saw that Putin both said that they were ending wars with Donald Trump.
Who was the first person you said?
I think just Gaza.
Oh, Gaza.
Do you think that that's going to last until he's elected, and then do you think it's going to this kind of idea of world peace going to last even through his presidency?
So Donald Trump's style of foreign policy is transactional. Everything he does, he sees as a one-to-one dyadic transaction. So he sees it as I'm just negotiating with you, it's just you and me, leader to leader or whatever, and get the best deal that I can. So if Donald Trump feels that, you know, the Americans want the war in Ukraine, let's say, to end, or the war in Israel, Gaza to end, Donald Trump's strategy, I would guess, is to go in there and negotiate to achieve that thing. But achieving that thing in both of those situations is going to make some very large population very, very upset, right? So Donald Trump's version of ending the war in Ukraine is either just stop giving them any kind of support, or in both places really, either just stop sending weapons, which I don't think is going to happen in the Israel case, but could happen in the Ukraine case, or it's go in and help them negotiate, which is going to look on the Ukraine side, probably something like asking Ukraine to give up some land. Which Zelensky has been very firm that that's not on the table. With Netanyahu is also a right-leaning authoritarian style leader in the same vein as Trump. And the prospects there, I think, are very, very poor. You know, he had a very, very simplistic approach to how to handle Israeli politics during his first administration, and put Jared Kushner on the job, and it did nothing except move the capital, basically. And so, yeah, I don't have high hopes for those things getting resolved in a way that makes parties satisfied. Like, the only way those things end are, you know, some big population of people being pretty upset about the end of conflict. So what will be interesting to see is if he prioritizes end of conflict over some other outcomes, right? Which is not what we're seeing from Netanyahu and Zelensky right now. Who hasn't spoken? Tell me your name. Bennett.
Regarding how Democrats shifted towards the center and the Republican Party mostly is like catered towards their base, and that ended up working out. Does that represent like a change in like effective like presidential like campaign strategy?
Well, I think we don't know yet, because what happened, I mean, the Harris campaign was definitely packing to the middle. I agree with that, and especially towards the last couple weeks of the campaign. But they failed to get the turnout, right? So I think at the end of the day, we're going to be looking at, you know, several millions of voters who just decided who voted for Joe Biden, who just decided to stay home. And that to me is the question mark. What explains that? Is that sexism and you know, racial animus? People just, you know, I could, you know, do it to vote for the old white guy, but not for the, you know, brown lady. Is it just general dissatisfaction? I think we don't know. So I'm not gonna stand here and guess, because we don't know what the answers are. Your instincts that looking at how this campaign went and what the results were might impact how people campaign in the future are absolutely right. Like, that's organically how this goes. Campaigns reflect, they adjust, and they do something different. The Trump campaign is weird though, right? Because they weren't trying to expand any electorate. They were just turn out the base. Turns out they still made the base bigger than anybody thought it would be. Well, not anybody, but, yeah. Victor.
So what I noticed from the Trump campaign is that he had a lot of exposure in the media, especially with Elon endorsing him.
He knows how to get earned media.
Yeah, that was the one thing I noticed, especially on Twitter,
Yep.
that it's just a bunch of ads.
All you have to do is say something outrageous, and then he gets a bunch of free media.
Yeah, so I think
That's the recipe.
he was on like podcasts and everything, and with like big names, so I think his name really got out there, and then Harris
Yeah,
tried.
the Joe Rogan thing is interesting.
Yeah, and then Harris tried doing something similar, but I think for her that she didn't go the right way. in that sense.
I encourage you not to overthink that stuff. I mean, she was on SNL, she was doing the influencer podcast, and she did a lot of stuff. It was a very disciplined campaign, I would say. And at the end of the day, here's a data point I didn't put in the slide deck that maybe will convince you. The margin of vote in non-battleground states, so not the 7, the other 43, in the non-battleground states, the margin of vote was Republicans +6 on average, right? Even though, like, taking into account California, Wyoming, everything, on average, Republicans +6. In the battleground states, it was Republicans +3. So that tells me that in the battleground states, which is where the campaign is happening, that the Democrats did better than they would have. that tells me it's a campaign effect. I mean, and it says to me that that's the Harris campaign having a successful impact on what would have maybe been the outcome in the absence of campaigning. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. Remind me your name.
My name is Jeremy, and yeah, thank you for explaining for coming over to talk all of it, but. One thing that I wonder about Trump, like potentially expanding his base of support or being able to bring up turnout with those who he got votes from in 2024, do you think some degree of that is attributable to his, I suppose, trying to appeal to people on the political fringe who may not have necessarily been Trump supporters,
Yeah,
like people who, believe in conspiracy theories.
I didn't put it in the
people who have
slide
a
deck.
Strong sense that politics is corrupt in general.
Yeah, I didn't put it in the slide deck, but we do have good evidence that first, people who were voting for the very first time in this election broke more for Trump than for Harris. Even young people, even people in their age category broke more for, the margin went more towards Trump than towards Harris relative to 2020, I would say. So, yeah, so that is what the political strategy of that sort of conservative populist movement is doing, is it's tapping into that amygdala driven, anger and whatever else that is, very attractive to a lot of folks. Okay, I'm gonna take, Allison's question and then, we're gonna call it a day.
With the recent Supreme Court granting presidential immunity, do you think that the division that we still have in Congress will be enough to hamper any of Trump's threats to democracy?
I think you don't know.
We don't know yet.
I mean, a lot of that's gonna hinge on what happens with the House. If the Democrats manage to get the House, then that will provide a pretty decent check on some things. If they don't and Republicans take it, then my question is gonna be by what margin? Like, do they have to stay a fully unified party, or do they have some room to spare in terms of number of votes? So that'll be really telling as to how much of a check Congress can be. Beyond that, powers of the presidency have been expanding over the last 5 decades. And so he will have a lot of authority to do a lot of things. All right. Hang in there. It's gonna be fine. The work that you all do to build civic society in your organizations, on your campus, with your clubs and in your communities, that's the work of democracy. So continue to do that, and I will see you all later.